Wow, thank you for coming out. I'm Helena Hansen, and I am the Interim Chair of Psychiatry and Interim Director of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. I'm also an addiction psychiatrist and a cultural anthropologist, as well as a mother. I'll get to that in a moment. I want to start by acknowledging, first of all, what a hard topic we've taken on tonight. And I'm going to bet that each and every one of you has been personally touched by the youth mental health crisis. That may be one reason why you came out tonight. And also statistically speaking, that's what I would guess. I know that I've been personally affected on so many different levels. As interim chair and director, I've been contacted by really concerned hospital administrators, parents, community practitioners, people running community organizations. They are seeing this youth mental health crisis play out right in front of them. I have also been the advisor and co-author to a very talented MD PhD student here at UCLA, Joe Friedman, who was the first to report to the media that the overdose death rate among youth 10 to 19 went up over 100% over a 2-year period, 2019 to 2021. So this is real. As an addiction psychiatrist, I'm seeing it from that angle. I'm also the mother of a college senior whose college career has been profoundly shaped by the youth mental health crisis and who had a childhood friend commit suicide in his sophomore year. It really made it so difficult for him, for his friend's family. It was just such a formative experience and a struggle. So I just want to acknowledge that if I've experienced it from all of those angles, each one of you has probably experienced it from many, many different angles. And so I also want to really congratulate you for taking on this difficult topic head on. So another thing I want to do is just say that I've come to appreciate in my time as interim chair and interim director of the Semel Institute what a resource we are sitting on here at UCLA. So the psychiatry department consistently ranks in the top 5 in the country clinically. We have master clinicians on our faculty and staff, and that is also related to the Semel Institute, which is one of the country's largest 2 to 3 mental health research institutes. It's internationally renowned. So we're actually in the midst of experts, the people who are actually designing the interventions and assessments for suicide risk, for substance abuse, for eating disorders, for a host of the things that our children are facing and coping with right now. So we thought, and I want to really thank our Friends of Semel board and our Resnick Psychiatric Hospital board for the foresight to bring us together to share some of the incredible expertise that we have on the youth mental health crisis. And we want to give the community the opportunity to benefit fully. So that's what this conversation is about. So we really want your active participation with our experts so that we can all learn together and orient ourselves toward a way forward from this crisis. I want to thank the Friends of Semel and the Resnick Psychiatric Hospital Board for hosting and organizing. I want to briefly mention some activities that are coming up around wellness and mental health for teens that might interest you. We'd certainly warmly welcome you and encourage you to spread the news. There's going to be a Gen Z Wellness Summit that will be held in person. And you'll notice that this particular event was not hybrid. I am so glad that so many of you came out in person. I know we had over 500 people register. We are going to make the recording available. So I have the feeling a lot of people are going to avail themselves of that. And please feel free to share the recording. But we're trying to encourage in-person events in relation to mental health. Connecting in person, very important for us as a species. So it's not me to be thanked, it's really the boards, the Resnick Hospital Board and the Friends of Semel Board that had the foresight. So they're hosting another in-person event, February 25th, so that's the Gen Z Wellness Summit. There's also an Open Mind Film Festival for high school students. They They make the film, they select the films, and it's in person and live streaming on April 21st. So the website for these events is on your handout. And I want to thank the panelists who you're going to be spending the next hour plus with. I also want to say that we're going to show a short video that was produced by the Friends of Semmel and the Resnick Psychiatric Hospital Board that gives you a little bit of background on both organizations. And the person narrating is on our Resnick Psychiatric Hospital Board, Lisa Kudrow. So I think we're going to show the film now so that you get a little background.
Hi, I'm Lisa Kudrow, and mental health is important to me. That's why I became a member of the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. Together, let's explore some of the programs and meet some of the preeminent faculty of the Semmel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital.
What we are unique in doing here at the Semmel Institute is integrated neuroscience that moves findings from the laboratory bench all the way to translational research, as well as bringing them to the community.
One thing that's really unique about the Semmel Institute is this collaboration between people doing basic science, like basic neuroscience, as well as clinicians who are working in intervention and treatments. And so what it means is that we're not just studying the brain, we're not just treating patients, we're actually integrating those two things.
Taking care of patients with particularly challenging, treatment-resistant, difficult problems, bringing comfort, relief, sometimes even cure, but working in a context of people who are engaged at all levels of discovery kind of mean we're all in it together and we are all learning from each other all the time.
The dedicated clinicians and scientists at the Semmel Institute and Resnick Hospital work collaboratively to find the answers that can overcome our most human challenge. It's our understanding of the mind and brain.
We provide an environment where we're taking care of patients and delivering world-class care to people of all walks of life. And at the same time, we're training the next generation of psychiatrists and mental health professionals through our residency training programs and internships across all different fields.
The Semmel Institute is one of the only integrated centers for psychiatric research and clinical care in the world. Here, research is done to advance innovative treatments and offer clinical programs for illnesses and disorders that cover the lifespan from early childhood to the geriatric years, including autism, addiction, Alzheimer's disease, depression, bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, PTSD, OCD, and many other illnesses and disorders of the mind and brain. These important programs include the Achievement Behavior Cognition Child Program, known as ABC, which works with young children with mental health and behavioral challenges and provides support for their families. The UCLA Peers Clinic helps adolescents and young adults with social challenges stemming from autism, anxiety, and depression.
When we first developed the Peers program back in 2004, we were initially targeting adolescents on the autism spectrum. But we quickly discovered that it wasn't just adolescents that were struggling socially. There were a lot of adults that were struggling socially as well.
The Division of Adult Psychiatry, including the Adult Mood Disorders Clinic, treats patients with a wide spectrum of illnesses and disorders. And the Mindful Awareness Research Center focuses on mental well-being.
We're teaching people stress reduction, finding a way of connecting to themselves, finding more ease, and really offering mental wellness.
The principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, otherwise known as JEDI, define the vision and values of the faculty.
Understanding structural forces and social determinants of health is really key to mitigating an equitable health outcome. I'm really trying to focus on diversifying and inclusifying the biomedical workforce so that we have all voices, all abilities at the table, driving our research agenda to increase health equity.
At the Spanish-speaking psychosocial clinic, the biomedical workforce is diverse and inclusive.
Nearly 50% of people in California are Latino or Spanish speaking, and we don't have enough clinicians. So only about 2% of licensed psychologists are Spanish speaking. So there's a huge gap and a huge need.
The clinical programs of the Resnick Hospital include ongoing support for the UCLA Homeless Healthcare Collaborative, a community outreach program offering equitable, high-quality health care for the unhoused.
The work of a street psychiatrist is to identify ways that we can support people experiencing homelessness around their mental health needs so that we can move them toward housing and toward safety.
There are some large societal problems out there like poverty and homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse. But if we could intervene early after people are exposed to those early life adversity or adverse childhood experiences, then we can change the trajectory of people's outcomes so they can become more functional members of society.
The Longevity Center at the Semel Institute helps adults and seniors with everything from cognitive training to psychological services.
We work with older adults doing diagnostic testing for people with memory problems, but we also are able to do psychotherapy to help people with depression and anxiety, and we work in depth with their caregivers of people with dementia.
From bench to bedside at the intersection of science, health, and culture, extraordinary minds come together with one goal: to make the world a better place for the millions of people who live with an illness of the mind or brain and their families and loved ones. Together, they have a steadfast commitment to enhancing lives through pioneering research, quality educational programs, first-rate healthcare services, and revolutionary treatments. Our goal is to see the day when Alzheimer's is a distant memory, when autism is just another human variation, when depression is overcome, addictions released, and the paradigm shift in belief erases the pain of stigma. On behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, we thank you for your support. To learn more, please go to semel.ucla.edu.
So now we have a chance to speak with some of the faculty that you got a glimpse of in person. And I'm going to introduce both the moderator and the panelists right now. I think we're getting chairs set up for this discussion. So you're going to be hearing from Dr. Eric Chung, who is pictured in the video. He's the Chief Medical Officer of the Resnick Psychiatric Hospital. Then there's Timothy Fong, who's Clinical Professor of Psychiatry, and Manal Khan, who's a pediatric and adult psychiatrist at UCLA, Jena Lee, Director of the Pediatric Emergency Psychiatry Program at UCLA, John Piacentini, who's Professor of Psychiatry and Chief of Child Psychology at the School of Medicine at UCLA. He's also Director of the Center for Child Anxiety, Resilience, Education, and Support, the CARES Center. So while we're getting set up, I just want to note that at the conclusion of this panel, this conversation with the panel that you're going to hear from, so I'm going to be back with you at the end and give you some parting thoughts. Do we have the panelists here? Okay, I think it's time. And I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Eric Chung. Okay, so I've been asked to remind you, you should have received cards that are available for you to write questions on. And we have someone designated to collect these cards. So we actually have the chairs of both boards as our card collectors. Thank you, Vicki Goodman and CC Filer. So we're going to be compiling questions. As soon as something occurs to you that you really want to pose to the panel, please write it down and signal that you have a card to hand in when it's ready. Thanks. So now you're going to hear from Dr. Chung.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming out. I'm happy to be the moderator for this austere panel here. And thank you, Dr. Hansen, for the warm-up and introduction. I actually would like to begin by having each of our panelists say just a touch more about who they are, where they're working, and the kind of work they're doing. And then we're going to dive into some questions. We'll start with Dr. Lee.
Hello, thank you for having me here. So I direct the pediatric emergency service, psychiatric service, as well as the pediatric consult liaison service. So basically what that means is that whenever someone under 18 comes to our emergency room, or they get admitted to the hospital for a medical reason even, and they have a psychiatric emergency or crisis, suicide being one of the most common reasons I see our patients for, that's the service that I work with. Is that enough, or did you want a little more?
That's a good start, Dr. Lee. Dr. Khan.
So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. I work on the inpatient service. I am also the Associate Program Director for the Child and Adolescent Fellowship. I am a Max Gray Fellow as well, so I'm developing further expertise in pediatric mood disorders. And then I also supervise the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Clinic with Dr. Lee as well. So few hats that I wear at UCLA.
Thank you. Dr. Piacentini.
Hi, I direct the CARES Center, which you heard, which is a center designed to increase awareness and early prevention of anxiety in children, youth, and families. We work with schools, with primary care physicians, and others that work with children and teaching best practices for recognizing anxiety and managing it. I also direct the Child OCD Anxiety and Tic Disorders Program, which is a clinical research program. So we have clinics where we provide evidence-based treatment, cognitive behavior therapy, and psychopharm or medication to youth with those disorders.
Thank you. And Dr. Fong, who brought his own fan club with him tonight.
Well, you know, it's LA. I thought this was an improv. I thought I had some fresh material to work out here. Thank you, everybody. Again, my name's Dr. Timothy Fong. I'm a professor of psychiatry. I've been in LA since 1998. And I've been part of this department for now 25 years. So I have a lot of the knowledge of what really goes on behind the scenes. But as an academic psychiatrist, as an addiction psychiatrist, I really do four things. Number one, I see patients. And that's the core. As an addiction psychiatrist, I still provide care in person and telehealth for addictive disorders and mental health. I run, number two, research, our UCLA Gambling Studies program, where we study the impact of gambling behaviors on body, brain, and mind. And secondly, the other research group I'm part of is the steering committee of the UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids, so also studying the impact of cannabis on body, brain, and mind. So yes, Monday through Fridays, I study gambling, drugs, alcohol, and cannabis, leaving me the weekend to recover from, wait, that's what the patients do on the opposite. So that's number two. Number three, I do a lot of education and talking to anyone who will listen to what I have to say about addiction, from undergrads, high schools, all the way up to our addiction fellows, all the way up to our faculty. And lastly, this is what we do in academics, is community engagement. We used to call it advocacy, no longer. It's community engagement, because it's us connecting with the community, learning from the community, and sharing with you things that we learn from our office. So thank you for having me here tonight.
It was a good bit. I think it landed well. Thank you, Tim. So as Helena said, we encourage you to write your questions out. Cards are available, are being circulated. We'll be sure to pull those up after we do some of the lead-off questions. We really want to hear from you and answer some of the questions you have out there in the audience. We're going to start with a heavy one. We're going to start with suicide. And a recent survey by the CDC reported that 1 in 3 high school girls and 1 in 5 high school boys in the U.S. have seriously considered suicide. That's up from the years prior. Over 50% of teens report feeling persistently sad or hopeless, also a record high. ED visits have risen sharply over the last decade. We see this with our very own eyes. And a parent said to me, "My teen and I are getting into more arguments lately, and it often ends with him yelling that he'd be better off dead and slamming his bedroom door behind him." And I want to know, as a parent, as parents, how can we find out if our child is actually suicidal?
So this is a question that I often get from most families that I see every day. And what I first want to do in answering or attempting to answer the question is take away some of the pressure, because as someone who does this every single day, the purpose of my job is to see kids coming to the ER and literally assess to see if they need more help or if they can go home. That's my job. And I cannot predict who's suicidal and who's not. So, but that's the bad news. The good news is the only other alternative we have is actually not, it's actually helpful and therapeutic. So instead of thinking, how do I know if my son is suicidal? I gotta make sure he's safe, which is completely valid. Our approach that we like to teach our families is, look at the numbers you just heard. 1 in 3 girls, a third of your daughters, right? 1 in 5 boys have planned a suicide plan. And these are not just surveys, these are objective evidence of people coming to our ER. So if it's that common, then don't ask, how do I know if my kid is suicidal? Ask, assuming my kid is suicidal, how do I make it so sure that they're gonna be comfortable to come to me? I think that it takes a lot of pressure off of parents. It gives us a plan, and just the very fact when we the very act of trying to focus on how do I make it safe and comfortable for my kid, my teenager, my child to come to me and talk about this really heavy topic, that already solves like half the problem. And I'm telling you this stuff not because I learned it in textbooks, I learned it from the kids and teens themselves. I have a lot more, but I don't want to hog the mic, so I'll share more as if you guys really want to learn more deets.
I'm going to give you a couple of follow-ups, if I may. Do you have any tips about asking about suicide without angering somebody or without driving them away?
Yeah, I mean, you know what's interesting? I do want to share with you guys and give just the family members and empower you and give you guys some hope. The 2 most important things I think I learned from my training 10 years ago as a resident that really stuck with me before I knew I was going to be in the ER is my program director, Dr. Shashank Joshi. He never let us let a kid go home from the emergency room if they couldn't identify one adult, parent, grandparent, teacher, coach, guardian, that they felt comfortable to go and actually tell them about their suicidal thoughts if they were to have them. Okay, the reason I say that is because there's so much power that families have. The second thing I learned from residency is one of my program directors actually said, if you don't have a chance with the parents, you don't have a chance with the kid. And parents extends to grandparents, relatives, cousins, teachers, educators, clinicians. And so that's kind of the context from which I come. Now, I spoke so much that I forgot the question. The question is,
how do we get them to open up if they're angry without having them lie to us?
So the reason why I went through that context is because I think in the question, which I get a lot from parents, there's a lot of very valid like fear and anxiety. It's like, how do I talk to my kid about drugs? We'll learn soon. But how do I talk to them about anything difficult like sex or like, and I think what I've learned from teens is instead of coming with like, I need to talk about suicide, I need to talk about if they're safe, what they're doing, try to come more and actually have a listening ear. I think the key, one of the take-home pearls, if I share anything with you guys that I think would be helpful, is there's nothing as powerful as empathy, that all these teenagers that will never let you in on their secret that they actually want to be heard by you and they actually care what you think, they'll never let you in on that, but they do care. And if you sit down and try to listen to the narrative, their experiences, everything that led to the suicidal thoughts, they're far more likely to share with you. So adolescents and children are much less likely to share about their suicidality than adults are. So it's a tough job even on someone like me who does it professionally. But as family, if you come at it trying to really understand them and not trying to assess them, I think that makes a huge difference.
Thank you. Suicidal ideation and behaviors can be understood in many ways as a symptom of or a sign of an underlying mental health problem. And almost half of all mental health disorders will start by age 14, meaning that it's quite important for us to have early intervention and detection. Dr. Piacentini, how do you tell the difference between what's normal and what's abnormal when it comes to something like anxiety, which is as pervasive as any condition in this population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And anxiety increases the risk for everything else here. And anxiety is usually the first disorder or problem to emerge. So early intervention for anxiety hopefully has a lot of positive impact with regard to preventing depression, suicidal thoughts, and substance use. But anxiety is completely and absolutely normal. Anxiety is critical to life. Anxiety is one of the most helpful emotions that we have. How many of you have heard of fight, flight, or freeze? That's anxiety. So anxiety has evolved over time to keep us safe. And the problem with problematic anxiety is that for many people with anxiety, kids and adults, their anxiety goes off when there's no danger. Either because they're genetically programmed to be more sensitive, they've lived in an environment where there may be more danger or more threats. So when their anxiety goes off, they interpret situations that others might think would be even positive as being potentially dangerous. For example, most kids want to go to birthday parties and see friends. Most kids want to go to Six Flags. Anxious kids don't want to do any of those things because they're terrified for different kinds of reasons. So it's critical first to understand that anxiety is normal. The second thing is in terms of when does normal anxiety become problematic? Well, anxiety becomes problematic when it starts interfering with the child's life. It either starts to happen more frequently, it starts to lead to more intense reactions, it becomes more uncontrollable for kids, and it starts interfering with their lives. When anxiety gets to the point where the children are no longer really able to function, it becomes severely disruptive for the family, the child becomes isolated, they become depressed, then we start thinking about the need for treatment.
Avoidance is a common reaction to anxiety. How can parents think about getting their teens to talk to them or do the things they need to do that they might be avoiding, like even going to school?
Exactly what Dr. Lee said, an empathetic ear. So not most, but the chance of an anxious child having one or more anxious parents is low or high? High, absolutely. So as an anxious parent, when we see our kids struggling with anxiety, that makes us anxious. And we start doing all of the things we don't want them to do. So it's critically important for parents to be open, to not be judgmental. When Bobby or Sally come home from school and they look a little perturbed, the first thing that mom might say or dad, what happened? Was that kid mean to you again? Did you get a bad grade? Did somebody try to hurt you? I'm going to go to that school and take care of you. No, I just am tired. So we oftentimes as parents or educators or whoever can foster the anxiety and reinforce the anxiety. We catch our kids behaving in the things that we don't want them to do because that sets off our anxiety. We never really catch our kids being good or being healthy. That's what we need to do. And when we have a child that we think is anxious or we know is anxious, we cannot come at them from a stance of anxiety or worry. We come to them with empathy, as Dr. Lee said. We are open-ended. We ask them how things are going. And it also can be very helpful for kids, for parents to self-disclose a little bit. You know, when I was in that same situation, remember when I got invited to the birthday party for the whole class the first time, I was pretty scared. I was pretty nervous. I wasn't really sure what to do. And I talked to my mom or dad about it, and they gave me some ideas, and we kind of talked about it a little bit. And I found a friend that was, my good friend, was a little nervous too. We decided to go together, and it was really fun. And the next time they get the invitation, they're okay.
Thank you. Dr. Khan, a parent told me that their son doesn't have many friends, keeps to himself, seems awkward, moody, lacks motivation, can't get them interested in anything. How can I tell if something looks like depression? What's the difference between depression and normal teenage behavior?
Absolutely. So this is a great question, and I think, as Dr. Piacentini was also pointing out, there are going to be emotions that are normal. For example, fear, anxiety, sadness. Those are normal emotions, and those emotions are in service of giving us information about what's happening in the environment, so they serve a purpose. Whoever here has watched Inside Out can attest to the importance of emotions, right? However, when it becomes problematic or when it becomes a disorder I think about three things. Constellation, like are there symptoms that are kind of traveling together? For example, in his case, he's losing interest. He is moody, he's irritable, he's kind of isolating to himself. So there are things that are traveling together. The second one would be, is this a sustained shift? because every now and then we'll feel sad. However, if it is, the difference between climate and weather. So what is the sustained shift? And then the third thing would be, is it causing any kind of impairment? Is it getting into the way of school? Is it getting into the way of hanging out with friends or having enjoyment or having fun? So I think that becomes the differentiating point between what's depression and what's just sadness.
Let's talk a little bit about what treatment looks like for depression for teenagers. And one of the things that is, I think, unique about many of the psychiatrists working at UCLA is they tend to work in therapy as well as medications. What does therapy look like for teenagers? What approach do you take to engage teens in psychotherapy for depression, anxiety, or any other condition?
Absolutely. And again, a great question. I think when we are thinking about treatment, we are thinking about psychotherapy, medication management, or a combination of the two. With regards to psychotherapy, I would first want to say what psychotherapy is, because it is a formal or a professional relationship or an interaction which is informed by a theoretical framework and has scientific evidence that it is helpful. So it is different from just hanging out with someone. And there are some treatments that are psychotherapy, and then there are some psychosocial interventions as well. For example, social skills training and stuff like that. With regards to psychotherapy, it will depend upon the child's needs. So what are they presenting with? It will also depend upon their developmental age. It will depend upon the environment that they are in. So, and if I were to broadly kind of classify therapy, that it could be behavioral-based therapies, in which we'll have cognitive behavioral therapy, we'll have acceptance and commitment therapy, we'll have dialectical behavioral therapy, and we will have some talk therapies like supportive psychotherapy or psychodynamic psychotherapy.
Tim, you're up.
Yes, sir.
Rates of drugs, alcohol, and cigarette use have declined among high school students over the last decade, but that doesn't mean the problem has vanished. Some teens still turn to substances or develop addictive behaviors, whether they are unable to tolerate their thoughts or emotions as the result of environmental influences or for many other reasons. I know you've got a lot of advice, so let's hear it. What is your advice for proven techniques that every household could use to prevent addiction?
Well, how much time do I have? So I'll just start with this, and I'm constantly learning things. I'm a Generation X. When I grew up in the 80s, what did we learn about substance use prevention? Just say no. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? I learned it from you, Dad. We were taught that drugs were bad. We were taught that if you use drugs, you are not only bad, you are a bad person. If you got caught with drugs in school, you got suspended, and the keys were thrown away. We were told that tough love mattered, and you had to, quote, hit rock bottom. We've learned a lot since the 80s, right? And now, in 21st century, 2023, that is not at all what we need to know. What we need to know exactly is this. Teenagers and young people, you are the smartest people in the room. You're the ones that need to teach us. You're the ones that we need to empower so you can make the proper decisions. But it's our job as parents and as adults and as mentors to help shape that decision making. So there's two things I would highlight here. Number one, the first thing is really that the role of technology has changed everything when it comes to addiction. From crisis will come what? Opportunity. And really, the three things about technology I would highlight for addiction. Number one, technology brings the addiction to our table. So by the phone, we can order up drugs, we can order up all sorts of things through the phone that brings the addiction to your house. Number two, the technology in of itself is the addicting behavior, whether it's games, gambling, adult entertainment, social media, so that's the difference. But the third thing, and I rarely talk about this, that technology could also be the answer. It could bring you the ability to connect, it could bring you telehealth, it could bring you proper information. But when it comes to addiction and substances, no other world has been impacted by technology and as radical as a field. When I think about information and disinformation and misinformation, yes, we'll hear about that from suicide and depression and anxiety and ADHD and autism and all that stuff. But in no other world have we seen misinformation and wrong information about substances. As an example, number one, have we all seen that meme, number of Americans dead every year from opioids, 100,000. Number of dead every year from alcohol, 150,000. From tobacco-related causes, 500,000. But number of dead of Americans every year from cannabis, it'll say 0. That's a meme that gets out there, which is completely false. Unfortunately, men and women do lose their lives to cannabis. Maybe not cannabis overdose, but definitely cannabis intoxication. So I spin it all around, going back to this final point of very clearly saying we have an opportunity to use technology around us to help us connect. We have an opportunity to use technology around us to inform us better when it comes to substances. But we should not be afraid of the addictions that we hear out there. And yes, I hear a lot about the fear of 3,200 overdoses in LA County. 15 to 20 young people under the age of 18 dying from overdoses every year. At the same time, we have to look at all the other possibilities. And I'll highlight 2 things. Don, can you give me the Narcan? Don, give me the Narcan right there. So I really have 2 major things for everyone in this room. How many of you have in your medicine cabinets or in your car this? That's incredible. And for those of you who don't have that, what I'm showing you right now is Narcan naloxone. It's the overdose agent that reverses opioid overdoses. I came up with a term earlier as I was driving here. This is epinephrine for the brain. I thought that's pretty good. You like that? That's good? No, I'm patenting that. This is mental health epinephrine. This will save lives. And I have a freshman year son here, and when he went off to college, 15 minutes away from our house, I gave him Narcan. And he said, Dad, I don't need that. I said, you may not, but someone in your dorm might. And that's all we're doing. You can buy this over the counter, $45, or you can get a prescription from one of us to have your insurance cover that. So that's my take home number 1 for parents and young people and schools to have this in the medicine cabinets or in your cars. So I have a couple other to-dos, but that's a good starting point, and I'll come back with some more later.
Doesn't that even open up the conversation, Tim, to have this life-saving medication sitting on the cabinet invites a conversation with a teen, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, a lot of times we make this huge error where we prescribe it to the patient themselves, but we don't tell the parents or the family members about it. So I was thinking about this. It doesn't really help if I prescribe you, Narcan, and then you don't tell anyone, and then you overdose, and no one even knows it's there. So I've now gone to this idea that when I prescribe this, I need to tell another adult what this is. So, or I say to the patient, can you please make sure you talk to somebody about that, because this has to be a family event. This isn't just something to be hidden. And for parents who might find this in your child, saying this is not meant to be, oh my gosh, my child is using drugs, and therefore I'm going to go 1980s on them and yell at them and call them all sorts of names and send them to rehabs. This is not what we want. We want an open discussion, empathy. And I grew up in the 80s, and I grew up with tiger parents, Dr. Lee, Dr. Chung, tiger parents, where, it was very clear that, you had to do certain things, and you couldn't do other things. And that's something I really want to highlight for parents of my generation. We also have to learn how to parent with empathy and kindness and generosity. And we can't just say, when I was a kid, this is what my parents did, because that's not parenting that works for prevention of addiction in the 21st century.
Tim, you raised one more point before we leave this topic. So what is the first course of action for young people and families who are concerned about some developing substance use problems? What's the first step?
I've been thinking about this long and hard, and I think the first thing is from one of my favorite science fiction books of all time, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Don't panic. Don't panic. So the idea is, oftentimes we hear about this. We don't want helicopter parenting. And worse, we don't want snowplow parenting. Snowplow parenting where you literally do everything for the child, right? So I think the first thing is, if there's a discovery of substance use in the home, if there's a concern that your young person is using, you don't panic and then impulsively do something. You get informed. You get a professional. You have an open discussion. getting highly emotional and yelling and screaming and criticizing and judging is only going to drive a deeper wedge to people. So I was really thinking about that a lot, and I kept going back to that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because I really think it makes sense. Don't panic, get informed. And we have a young person here, Evie. Raise your hand. Calabasas, hi. Yeah, young person. And I asked her this very question, what should the first thing be? And she said, take action. I thought that was very good, but it's take informed action by getting educated and getting a professional opinion.
Thanks, Tim. We're leaving plenty of time and space for your questions, and I think we've collected some. So we have a few more prepared for them, but then we're going to turn to your questions. Please indicate if you need a piece of paper, and we'll start bringing those up soon. Dr. Fong, you opened the door to social media and phones in your description just now. This is for the group, and anyone can take this. So a study in 2019 found that teens who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media potentially face double the risk of poor mental health outcomes, like depression, like anxiety. 95% of teens say they use a social media platform. A third say they're almost constantly scrolling, posting, or engaging in some way with social media. So as experts, this panel of experts, what's your take on this? What's your advice regarding social media, phone use, and teen mental health?
I can start with regard to anxiety. The problem with social media is all this information is coming at kids without any context or any interpretation or any filtering. It's like society is blasting in their faces like a fire hose. So back in the day, you know, and I think social media is one of the greatest inventions of ever. I mean, it's revolutionizing the world. Our kids are smarter, but our kids are also more anxious, more depressed, more suicidal, and more likely to use drugs. The issue is that kids are getting all this information, and they have no way of determining what is true and what is false. The algorithms are set to addict our kids to this information. They can't break away even if they want to. And that most of the information is telling them the world is a bad place, you are out of step, you are not keeping up with everybody else. And it leads to incredible anxiety and self-deprecation. And it's a real problem, especially for kids that are anxious. They're afraid of missing out. Socially anxious kids may not have the ability to go socialize in real life, but they do it on social media, which leads a really inaccurate and untrue picture of what the world is like, making kids with anxiety and social anxiety feel even more out of step, more out of tune, which can lead to worsening anxiety and ultimately depression and maybe suicidality.
I can just add that before like the advent of social media, before it became so common, I think bullying or teasing or things like that could end. And I think like at the school or in a party or when you're hanging out with friends. But I think with social media, it has also taken a life of its own, that it is constantly there. And even generating rumors about someone is much faster. So I think also being aware of cyberbullying and the role that it also plays. And I will also add one more thing, that a lot of our brains develop in response to experiences that we have. And if social media is taking us away from those experiences or those connections that we'll have in the presence of people, that is another thing that social media kind of does to us.
The only thing I would add is if you look at the data, I learned recently that it seems to matter what the activity on social media and not just time. So those that are more engaged, if they're actually liking other things and if they're communicating, interacting, it seems to actually be protective. Whereas if you're just kind of the passive scrolling and not really engaging, that seems to be the most problematic and correlated with the concerning findings. And so kind of like the running thread here, I mean, it's kind of cool that what we're all four of us are saying is like the solutions are kind of the same. Engage your teenagers and children. When you talk to them, don't just say, are you suicidal? Are you doing drugs? Like, stop social media. Ask them what they like about social media. Ask them, get engaged in their life, and then also ask about if they have any thoughts about what on social media doesn't make them feel so good. Yeah, that's the only thing I would. And the second thing I would actually add is, kids see what you do, not what you say. So fix yourself. and yeah, start there.
So I have a couple things here. Number one, we have a special guest here in the audience, a good friend of mine, Dr. Don Grant, here in the front row. He's not going to say anything right now, but for those, he works for Newport Healthcare. He's also the National Director of Healthy Device Management. So he spends his career understanding social media and the impacts on the brain. So please, after with the show, stop by if he's willing to talk. He absolutely will. He'll share some things. But he's taught me a few things through the road. So number one, the way I think about this is think about all the dopamine that's incurred from social media, the likes, the intermittent reinforcement. So the antidote, what we're now using in our clinics and with our patients, is to say, how do we get healthier dopamine? What is on the healthier dopamine menu? And when I walk through with patients, it's everything we were taught in kindergarten, right? It's physical movement, it's getting skilled at something, it's in real life connections, it's getting 6 to 8 hours of sleep, it's not eating ultra-processed high foods. So suddenly you're like, wait a minute, that's what I'm paying you all this money, Dr. Fong? You're telling me to run around, eat 3 meals a day, get 6 hours of sleep, and talk to my friends? I said, yes. And how will you be paying for today's session? No. But in all seriousness, that's the antidote. And that's what we think about, the healthy dopamine menu. So I think about social media overuse as an unhealthy dopamine menu, as ultra-processed information, right? It's a Twinkie for your mind. So instead, that's the antidote: sleep, nutrition, physical movement. There's two other things. With our kids, we never limited screen time. We never took away their phones. I said, you know what, to my wife, we're not doing any of that stuff. It's not going to work because I'm too inconsistent in my parenting to do that. So instead, I said, our kids need to do the healthy dopamine menu to the fullest. They do all that stuff. I really don't care how much screen time they have. Now, we were very blessed that they were very good kids. But I walked in on our 14-year-old son the other day. He's got triple screens. He's got his Mac and his phone and his iPad, and he's got his feet up. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm doing my homework. He's got straight A's, so I can't quite complain. But the point is, the healthy dopamine menu first, then leaving the other stuff. And one last point, I was thinking about this on the way over. Why do we have a crisis right now? Sometimes we forget to even mention that, right? COVID, climate change, cultural and political tension. I could go on and on and on. This is not the 80s that I grew up in, where my biggest concern was, how do I solve the Rubik's Cube without cheating? That was my concern, right? But the biggest issue, and this is where I see it, we need to feel safe. And social media gives you a false illusion that you're safe. So I was thinking about that. For all the young people, that's what we're hearing about. The news today about what happened, unfortunately, in one of our South Bay high schools with guns. How do you feel safe? That's how we turn crisis into opportunity to increase that sense of safety. That's the biggest thing.
We're pulling out a couple of themes here, if I'm hearing all of you experts correctly. There's been a theme emerging of the importance of at least one consistent, stable, reliable, approachable, communicative adult in a person's life. Maybe it doesn't have to always be the same person, but there's a theme there about an adult who can be turned to and who they can dialogue with. We're getting another theme about teaching healthy, responsible, self-regulatory behaviors, not necessarily always imposing the rules upon them, but teaching them how to regulate themselves. Am I hearing you correctly? Okay. There's more questions that are coming in, and we're on the topic of social media. One that just came in is there an age, we actually hear this a lot, right? Is there an age at which you think social media is appropriate for teens? How early is okay?
Well, considering, kids, by the time you're a teenager, you're probably able to manage social media. The concern is 6, 7, 8-year-olds, that are on social media, and elementary age kids that are on social media, with really very limited ability to understand or put into context some of the things that they're seeing. Kids, elementary age kids, younger kids, their job is to play. And because playing teaches them how to become adults. You play house, you play doctor, you play whatever it is, and start developing some critical thinking skills, starting to imagine, what life would be like by taking on these different roles. Physical activity, the dopamine, the healthy dopamine, running, jumping, climbing. That is all going away with kids just sitting inside and digesting stuff that they can't understand. And it is kind of scary. Some of it's fun and some of it's kind of scary for them. So I think most adolescents are able, with certain limits, of course, but the young kids, it's really the problem. And once a kid's been on social media from age 6 to 12, good luck getting that phone or iPad or computer out of their hands.
You know, one of the reasons why that question might be so challenging is that it's a little artificial to say there's an age that fits for everybody. I think that's what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Piacentini, and what we may have just spoken about, which is not assessing, but understanding the developmental age of your kid, where they are relative to their chronological age. Are they responsible enough to begin to engage in social media in a way that won't take off as an addiction, or as an overload, or as an overuse? So it may not be as much an age itself, even though there might be some parameters, but some rough estimate of whether they're responsible enough to take that challenge on.
And it's also the family's responsibility, the parents and others in the family, to monitor and to teach and to explain and to provide some context in terms of what they're doing. That's the important thing. You're right, developmental age and the social network in which the child is living.
We're going to come back around, I'm sure, as I get through some of these questions here to social media. But we're going to go back to one of the earlier topics. And since we have several people who have intimate knowledge and work in the acute care setting, Dr. Khan, Dr. Lee, Dr. Fong, in the hospital setting, there was a question that came across about how do families get help, especially when they're worried and terrified about their child, their teen, being locked up, which is a term that can be used a lot, and actually maybe the frame of reference that a lot of people have about acute inpatient, which is to be locked up and then released and turned back to the world with no resources. Explain to us, if you would, what that process looks like, and is it really like that?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So locked up, I imagine what you're alluding to is the hospitalization. And I think what a lot of families don't realize when they do come to our ER and we're ultimately making the decision of whether it's really hospitalization or home, is that there are actually intermediary steps before the hospitalization. Now, some of that is limited by access and insurance for sure. And I don't want to go into the details. There's things like a partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient program. But I would, so there are steps in between. That's my first answer. The second is this notion of being locked up. I definitely bump into this a lot. The reason why I love working in CL and ER is because I get to have the privilege of working with families and patients that have not elected necessarily to see a psychiatrist. So they're like new. So they come in with these images that they've seen in movies and kind of like, am I going to get locked up? But whoever asked that question, I don't know how much detail to go into, but the hospital, this is why I tell the folks in the ER, and I'm sure all of you have been in the ER, not all of you have been in our inpatient units, and every inpatient unit is different, but this is why I tell our families, it's very different from the emergency room. It's so hectic, and there's people bleeding on the floor, and there's people yelling, all these different things. At least in our child and adolescent psychiatry unit here, obviously, it's an environment that we really make conducive to healing, surrounded by adults that are really trained in the exact needs that the children and adolescents have. And yeah, I mean, what I tell the kids is it's kind of like camp. It's nowhere near getting locked up, but I do know that I haven't been to all the hospitals in the community, and that there is some variety.
Dr. Khan, I'm sure you have a few things to say about the depth of assessment, the intensity of therapeutic activity on the inpatient unit, and that transition back to the outpatient and community environment.
Absolutely. So I have some of my inpatient team here as well. So shout out to them as well. I think going to that environment, I think it is definitely a little bit challenging for the parents, because they do get separated from their kiddos. Not that they are separated throughout, but there is a degree of separation that happens in most psychiatric units. And there are ways in which the team will continue to communicate to the parents, and the parents can visit and come on the unit and see their kiddo as well. So there is, so recognizing, the parents might be feeling anxious, but there is a lot that goes on in an inpatient unit. For example, I can talk about our inpatient unit where I have worked. We have psychiatry, we have psychology, we have educational consultants, we have RT, recreational therapy, occupational therapy, we have music therapy, we have dietitians, we have a really, really big and robust team. And people are providing services, and everyone who works on an inpatient unit, I can tell you that they have a generous, big heart, because this is an acute care setting in which they're working, and there's high kind of like emotional toll that this job also takes. So the people who are there are really committed to the work that they're doing. However, I also want to acknowledge that we will have to shift the language around inpatient as well. And I think even in our conversations, thinking about aftercare planning and not so much about like disposition planning, or like we also have a role to play in kind of correcting the language that we use. And as Dr. Lee was talking about, when it comes time for discharge, we think about, what would be the next appropriate level of care? Would it be something intermediate, like a partial hospital program or intensive outpatient program? Or can the kiddo get by with outpatient psychiatrist and therapist? So that is another big thing that we do on the inpatient unit, is thinking about aftercare resources and what the kiddo might need.
So one of the things I think super critical is, how many of us do we have an earthquake kit, right? But how many of you actually have a mental health emergency plan or a mental health emergency kit? Because when you're looking for help and you're in distress and you go to the Google machine, you type in, should I bring my kid to the ER, right? Or what to do with a suicidal kid. That's not helpful. So I've been noticing this more and more with families I work with, that we're just not prepared. So we need to get numbers and phone numbers and, bags ready to go and places to call and what to do if our child is distressed. And when our oldest son was young, he had his asthma attack and he was freaking out and he couldn't breathe. And I was like, no, we're not taking him to the hospital. It's a nightmare in the hospital. He's fine. I'm a doctor. I know what I'm doing. But it's our son, right? And then he started getting blue, and my wife's like, you know what? I don't think you know what you're doing. And I put him in the car. I didn't call 911. I drove up Westwood, and he passed out in the car. And I almost had a car accident. In other words, I was not prepared. I had no emergency plan for his asthma attack. So after that, we developed an asthma attack plan, which basically started with, Tim, you don't play doctor for your son. You call your pediatrician, you call 911, and you handle that stuff. But the truth of the matter is exactly that. And I want to empower everyone in this room to go home tonight and think, how can I prepare a mental health emergency plan, either for myself, for my family, for my clients, for my neighbors, anything like that. And oftentimes we say, well, what's the first person you should call? And in our world, honestly, if you don't have a mental health practitioner ready 24/7, which most of us don't, it's going to be your pediatrician. And it's going to be people you trust and you know. And I think that's where we reduce stigma. Because this is LA, where we say, hey, John, do you have a therapist you know? And that's kind of how we know. So when you build up your roster of other people you know. So that mental health emergency kit. So for a lot of my patients in addiction, it's going to be the Narcan. It's going to be potentially medications for anxiety or panic attack. It's going to be a listing of all the people to call, a reminder of that you will get through this stuff. I think that's really, really powerful. I think that's something we can do that. Because on our end, unfortunately, the worst thing we see is our parents and families drive into our emergency room that's already overloaded, and they have a distressing experience in the emergency room. Or they walk out of that emergency room and they didn't get admitted, or they did get admitted, and there's a lot of confusion. We don't want to do that. I think that's part of our panel here tonight, is empower you to know when it's appropriate to bring in, who do I call, and if I don't know who to call, that's how to research that so you can build your own mental health kit.
Thank you. We have a lot of good questions in here. We're going to get back to some of them in a second, but I need to introduce another important topic to all of you panelists, college pressures. Have you ever met, anyone here ever met Teens or parents who describe worry, anxiety, obsession about college admissions. Sound familiar? When a teen describes having trouble or is showing excessive anxiety and pressure when it comes to getting into college, maybe that's something like catastrophic thinking, Dr. Piacentini. What are the different approaches parents and teens can take to try to help?
Oftentimes, the teens that are as anxious as that are living in environments where everybody else in the family is equally or more anxious than they are. So I think it's really important for parents and others in the child's environment, grandparents, older siblings, to model more of a calmer approach. You know, everything usually works out for kids, and all the stakes are, you know, really high for kids, and it can be so disturbing. We see so many kids in our clinic that are coming in for treatment due to trying to get into the best college, the best high school, whatever it might be. So we want to have the parents really calm down, support the child, say, you know, you are a great kid, you are going to get into a school that matches what you are looking for, or matches you in terms of your temperament and your personality. And wherever that is, we are going to love you. We're going to be very happy. Some kids, you know, want to go to the top schools, and even the parents may know that it's unrealistic. It's okay for the child to apply if they want to, but we need to be realistic with our kids about what to do. There are also a lot of other things that we can use. You've heard about some different kinds of techniques, but a lot of stress management techniques. Anxiety, you know, distress tolerance techniques. You can find a lot on our website on the carescenter.ucla.edu. We have a lot of information for families in this regard. The other panelists, I'm sure, have their favorite activities as well. But it's really important for people to stay calm, to model calm, to be accepting, to model acceptance, and maybe have the conversation with the child about what might be realistic and what might not be. It's okay to apply to a couple stretch schools, but all the eggs in the basket of something that the parents know is completely unrealistic is not going to be helpful.
Kind of reframing the stakes, broadening the opportunities here. A related topic is perfectionism. Where does it come from? How do you work with or treat excessive or problematic amounts of perfectionism? Any of you?
I can go there again.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the disorders that we're talking about, you know, there are some genetics to that. It's not uncommon that kids oftentimes resemble their parents in terms of personality and even mental health. We know a lot of these disorders are genetics. That's some of the amazing work that's going on here at UCLA, looking at genetics and other biological bases for these disorders. So for some youth, they may inherit a tendency towards perfectionism. Perfectionism can also be supported, reinforced through perfectionism and other family members, exacting parents or others in their lives, teachers, for example, that expect things to be perfect and exactly the way they want them, oftentimes above and beyond what the child's ability might be. We see perfectionism is related to anxiety, but it's not anxiety. But perfectionism and trying to achieve something that is only achievable with tremendous effort to the detriment of other activities in the child's life can be quite damaging. So we want to make sure that when we see kids that are working with this, they're experiencing this, that we're able to work with them, to teach them strategies for managing their perfectionism. We treat this in our clinic. We use something called exposure therapy, of gradually working with the kids to make mistakes and to expect bad things to happen and then put them in situations where the bad things don't happen because they didn't do something right, and gradually teach them to learn how to soften their thoughts, and maybe it won't be so bad. I love telling parents, I'm going to turn your unhappy A student into a very happy B student. And the kid's going, yes, and the parents are going, no. But that's kind of what it takes sometime.
I just want to, I stopped myself after your first question, but I feel like I need to pound down what you're gently suggesting. I actually did my training in Palo Alto while there was just an outbreak of suicide and completed suicides. it was so much that they actually placed us into the high schools, and we were doing training and treating the kids at school. And very high achievers, very prestigious high schools. And I remember being in the ER, and we would ask these kids, what is it? Like, what causes all this stress? Are we having tiger moms? What is it? And the kids would just say, no, they don't do anything wrong. It's just who they are. My parents are like, they're so successful, and there's just so much internalized pressure. So I feel like that's a really important message to cut across, at least in front of this crowd here. Yeah.
I will just quickly add one phrase that I really love, and that is mourn the ideal to love the real. So let go of the situation that you have idealized, even with regards to your kid or the kid that you thought that you will have, to just love what is in front of you. So I kind of lived by that phrase.
Dr. Khan, I like that. Mourn the ideal to love the real. Mourn the ideal. You have to release the fantasy sometimes. Okay. We're going to circle around. We're doing a little bit of bouncing around, but we're coming back now to the topic of suicide where we began, just for a moment here. A couple of questions from the audience compiled here now is, there were articles in the LA Times over recent weeks portraying schools' responses to student suicide in a rather negative light. We're interested in any responses to that, but I think it really pairs with this next question, which is what school-based strategies might be effective to improve mental health or responses to these situations, or what would be recommendations for teachers who are working with kids in these situations on a day-to-day basis in their classrooms?
It's a loaded question. I mean, I'll speak from my short but training working in schools to kind of try to figure out that exact question on the ground. And you know, I think the strongest message I could share with is to educators, and making the same kind of advice that we are sharing with parents. Often the educators are the ones that kind of are the only adults that a lot of children have. But I think it's making that I'm gonna use this question to actually share with you a pearl that I really wanted to share. And instead of waiting for the question, I don't know how late we are in time, I'm just gonna use it. Because I feel like so many parents love this when they hear it. So back to your Narcan thing, which I loved. How in the world do you have a safety plan for suicide, right? Like how there's no Narcan for suicide. So this thing that we do in our ER that I found just amazingly helpful from the feedback of literally the patients and teens themselves as I see them even after our ER visit is I ask the teenagers, what's the biggest reason why you don't want to tell your parent that you're having these thoughts? And even though they come in different colors, the bottom line is I'm afraid of their response. Not that they're gonna get mad at me necessarily, not that they're gonna lock me up, but it's just, I've even heard answers, I don't want them to think they did anything wrong. I don't want them to think that, answers are just so profound. And so much pressure is relieved when we make a plan in the ER and we simply say this, let's not say if, back to my first answer, when Sally has suicidal thoughts again, just like the child is so anxious about telling the parent about their suicidal thoughts, I mean, you're anxious about how to address it. Imagine how more anxious they are. You're supposed to be the parent, and they're the ones that's struggling with these thoughts, right? So in front of the parent, in front of the child, we have this exercise. So they're hearing it from a third party, from a doctor saying, it's not if, it's when. It's 1 out of 3 girls, right? 1 out of 5 boys. So when it happens, Sally, what would be the most helpful thing for you, for mom to do? It could be, and I give examples of true anecdotes from other teens. I say, examples I've heard is, mom, don't say anything. Just get in the car and drive me to McDonald's. I've even heard, let's get a lizard, let's go to the mall and let's just walk, but don't ask me anything. We get so basic and crude that we say, what if the mall's closed? What if it's 2 a.m.? Then don't ask me questions, but give me my space, and because I shared with you that I'm having these thoughts, I've earned some trust back. So you have the permission to check on me for every 5 minutes, but give me some space and don't ask me further questions for at least 30 minutes. We work something out. That not only brings down the anxiety of the kiddo to report to the parent, but it brings down the anxiety of the parent because parents don't know what the heck to do when their kid is going to come to them. They're just as nervous as the kid. So when you have this plan all planned out, and then I tell the parents, remember, it's not if, it's when. There's not this like, oh my God, my mom's going to be so upset when I finally break it to them and I actually tell them I'm, suicidal. Like, we want to unite as a team with our kids and the parents against these thoughts. It's not like something's wrong with me and what is my mom going to think of me, right? And so you think of this plan, and so the next time the thought comes around, the kid already knows how their parents are going to react. So the number one fear I hear about, I don't know how my parents are going to react, is already taken care of. And then the parent who's like, what do I do? Do I call 911, go to the ER or what? That's already taken care of too.
A little bit of scripting out and anticipating what the steps could be. I think that what I'm hearing in here also is that education can be helpful. Even if it's already happened, added education, further education for schools and for the teachers about how to have the conversation about suicide, that it's really not a topic that ought to be off limits. The more we can communicate about it, probably the better. And I think there's long been a fear that talking about suicide increases suicide, and that's long been dispelled. So communicating about suicide, getting one's own self, whether a teacher or a parent, comfortable with being able to talk about suicide, being knowledgeable about the degrees of suicidal thinking, the severity of suicidal behavior, so that we don't overreact or underreact, but have an appropriate reaction to the level that is presenting to us, whether in a school or in a home, may be a really good first step. One of the resources on the document that is available, if you picked it up on the way in or on the way out, will be those resources. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is what we use at UCLA in the inpatient setting to help with risk screening. It's not a full assessment. It's not going to tell you everything, but it's 6 basic questions that anyone can ask, whether in a church, whether in a teacher, whether a parent, whether a friend, whether a first responder for a colleague first responder. It's being used all over the place. So you may want to look at that and just have an understanding of that type of question rubric. It's very easy to use.
So a couple of things on that. I've been in practice 25 years, and I've unfortunately lost a number of clients to suicide and overdoses. And when I went back and talked to the family members, and I always say, did we miss anything? What were the signs? And the biggest thing is that suicidal thinking isn't a linear growing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it's inevitable. It's not like that. It's much more like a roller coaster. But we know there are a few things, right? When there's intense, severe, uncontrolled anxiety, when there's a sense of hopelessness, when there's a sense of physical, somatic, emotional pain. Those are things you can detect and sense. So I think a lot of folks that are doing school-based work, I really notice 2 things that I think are really missing in the young people's lives. And number 1 is mentorship. And mentorship either by the teachers or by neighbors or by the parents. And then we had our son graduated this year, and we had a thank you dinner. I said, who do you want to invite? He said, Dad, I don't want any of my friends there. This is your show. So I said, you know what? I'm going to invite all of your adult mentors. And we had 30 men and women in that room. And I get emotional thinking about it because they were like his teachers, they were his bosses, they were his hockey coach, there was his violin instructor, there was his boxing coach. It was adult mentors. And so when we think about things that matter for young people, it's adult mentors that make people safe. I think that's number 1. Number 2, we have an example of an evidence-based program here tonight. Ms. Lynn Peterson, right here, one on campus, and she has a nonprofit where when kids get pinched for vaping in school, so instead of getting suspended or detention, they get to enroll in her program called One on Campus, where they get time with other adults, time with other kids to get educated, restorative justice, and not get suspended. And it's something they can put on their college resume, too, that helps them get into college. So in actuality, when you think about school-based programs, that's exactly the kind of thing. It's bringing the community into the school to help solve a problem.
A question, this may be directed in the rough area of Dr. Piacentini and or Fong. What are your thoughts on treatment of depression or anxiety in adolescents with CBD or cannabis? In fact, all of you may have an opportunity on this. So treating depression or anxiety in adolescents with CBD or cannabis, thoughts?
I'll start and you can finish. The younger kids probably would.
Pass me the, no.
We get a lot of questions about that. I also work with Tourette's disorder, and CBD became very popular for Tourette's a few years ago, you may remember. And we had some parents wanting to give CBD oil to their 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. We have a lot of good evidence-based treatments that we have done in our program. We've done some of the largest studies ever for the treatment, looking at the treatment of anxiety. And we know that we have treatments that work. Cognitive behavior therapy, exposure-based therapy, which is a form of cognitive behavior therapy, SSRI medications, all lead to good outcomes when the treatment is done in a quality manner. That should always be the starting point. You always want to start with the treatments that have been shown to work. You know, when you go to your physician for something, you know, a broken arm, and they're going to put it in a cast. They're going to, for something else, they're going to give you certain kinds of medication that you know work, and they usually work. Mental health is a little bit less so. It seems much more broad, and people feel it's open game to try anything. We have treatments that work. UCLA is one of the leading institutes in the world for developing and testing treatments. So cognitive behavior therapy, exposure-based cognitive therapy, as Dr. Khan said, there are other treatments that can be used as adjuncts or add-ons to this treatment, but CBD or the like should never ever be a first-line treatment for these disorders. We probably, with teens and with kids, probably wouldn't consider it. There's really no evidence that it works in a systemic way. It might make the kids feel better, but a lot of things, you know, you can drink a beer and your anxiety goes away. That doesn't mean that it's a treatment. With adults, it may be a little bit different, but I would be very loath to consider these treatments for kids, certainly for kids, but even for teens with an anxiety disorder. I don't know about depression, but...
Same. Copy paste.
So here's the whole thing. Cannabis, Adult Use Marijuana Act, 2016. 7 years later, 2023. I wish I could say with certainty to you that yes, this is how CBD or any parts of cannabis can be used and medically. It's not. Unfortunately, there is no medical use of cannabis for mental health right now, period. Full stop, as our governor would say. So we start with some terms. Cannabis, of course, is the plant. And inside the cannabis plant are well over 100 different kinds of compounds called cannabinoids. One of the most popular ones, of course, is THC. That's the one that's psychoactive. CBD is another type of cannabinoid. It just happens to not be as psychoactive, but has all these other purported effects, pain, inflammation, anxiety, things like that. So unfortunately, the data is robust. It's not a debate. It's robust that none of these cannabis products will improve mental health conditions. They may improve the symptom, but it's not treating. So drugs are things that you put in your body that will change how your body functions, but medications are drugs that you put into your body that restore normal functioning. That is not what cannabis is. I wish I could be different and say that, but that's not where the world is. So we see this all the time. We want as humans a faster solution, something that works, something that's fast, something that's safe, something that's organic. That's just not what CBD is. And number two, this is an adult product. Not a single dispensary in California is allowed to dispense cannabis to anyone under the age of 21. And yet we've changed this and allowed young people to think that it's just weed, that it's okay. It is absolutely not. It is illegal for anyone under 21 to be buying, selling, distributing, consuming cannabis. It is illegal for a parent to give your son or daughter 5 milligram cannabis gummy. And yet we've normalized that. So the cat's out of the bag, but I want to put it back in and say, I want to put the edible back in the bag and say, this is not for young people. Your body isn't ready. Your mind isn't ready. And unfortunately, the younger you are, that's when you can develop problems. That's my long-winded answer to say, I wish we could say this is good for kids. It's not. And it sets a precedent, the worst, and Dr. Piacentini said it, by avoiding treatment that works. going down a lane that doesn't. Would you ever jump out of an airplane with a parachute that's experimental that you heard on the internet might be really good for you?
You know, the funny thing is, a lot of parents will come in and they'll say, we don't trust medications. We don't want to put our child on medications because we think they're bad for the kid. We want to give them cannabis instead. And for some, that's a balance. And it's like, no, don't do that, please. The medications have been used millions and millions of times. They're safe, they're effective. But a lot of parents go for these things that are completely unproven and potentially more dangerous. And, you know, as a parent, you know, I don't know what I would do. I as an evidence-based researcher and clinician, I know what I would do. But for a lot of parents, it's hard to think about putting your child into treatments. You know, when we talk about exposure therapy is we're going to make a list of all the things your child is afraid of, and then we're going to gradually expose the child to these things so that they can learn that they're not really dangerous. Well, to an anxious parent, that sounds like torture, even though it really isn't. We're really nice therapists. We play with kids. We have fun with it. But it's hard, you know, when something gets out in the media and gets out into the public, and then you say, but somebody on TikTok said it worked for them, forget it. It's all over. And we have great treatments, and unfortunately, not everybody knows that or wants to use them. Actually, probably more people than not, in some cases, avoid the evidence-based treatments at work in lieu of something else that they think might be better or safer, but really isn't.
Very good. We've touched on a lot of topics, from college pressures to social media to suicide, depression, anxiety. We have not yet talked about video games. How can parents set healthy boundaries when it comes to video games? The kid who's staying up until 2 and 3 a.m. playing Valorant or whatever first-person shooter game there is, rushing home from school and logging on to these online video games. What's the advice around this? When's it a problem? How do we approach it?
So here's the whole rub on this. So formally, we call video game addiction internet gaming disorder. It's kind of recognized in our handbook of how we diagnose stuff, but we see it all the time. And I would say right now I get maybe 3 to 4 calls a month from people saying, hey, my son or daughter is struggling with their relationship for video games. Video games are an important institution in our popular culture. It's there. But like any other addictive behavior, absolutely, it's very clear. So I say it very simply. Is your son or daughter's life, their quality of life, better or worse because of the video game? They continue to engage in the video game and they develop harmful consequences. That's a sign of a problematic behavior. And that's when we as professionals may need to step in. There are lots of reasons why they may be excessively playing the video game, from having a, quote, video game addiction, to having an untreated depression, to having ADHD that's not treated, to having trauma that's unaddressed, or frankly, just parenting that's too inconsistent and absent. So there's a lot of questions. There are solutions. And again, clear as day, over the last 23 years, there's not been a clear linear causality and association between violent video games and violent behaviors. We all wanted that because that would have explained these horrific things that we saw 22 years ago, but that's not true. I think what's more interesting is why is the demand for these video games so high, so elevated? Now, for instance, there's one that's just being released this week, Grand Theft Auto, incredibly violent, incredibly misogynistic, incredibly racist, incredibly popular. And again, a lot of that has to do with the dopamine and the serotonin and the cortisol and the action and all that, and where popular culture celebrates these things. The bottom line is, I always tell parents, if you're concerned about your son or daughter's video game, the first step you have to do is sit down and play those games with them. Do not make a judgment. Watch how they play. Understand their perspective. Understand what they like or don't like about it. Number 2, if you're really concerned, you got to get a professional. You start with a pediatrician and say, hey, I'm worried about my son or daughter's behavior. What should we do? And the pediatrician will take it from there. Everyone's got a pediatrician. Not everyone has access to men and women like ourselves. But most people with health insurance, and if you don't, can get a pediatrician, number 2. So again, video games are not an evil enterprise that's out there to make a nation of zombies in America. No. They are entertainment. and they are spectacular entertainment for a lot of other folks, but for about maybe 4 to 5% of the people who do play regularly, it is a concern. Again, our sons played a lot of video games growing up. It was one part of their dopamine menu. I can't say that nearly enough. It can be an expansive part. But then first thing, that I'll say it again and again, parents need to sit down with their son or daughter and say, what are you playing? What are you getting out of that? And if you see something that's really against your family's moral code or your values, you have to say with firmness why you're against that.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Fong. Next question, and I'm keeping an eye on our clock here. We do have an opportunity if you have any final questions coming up. This one's going to make us all uncomfortable. This is about access to healthcare services and the limited access. And this was actually highlighted in the Surgeon General's report, part of the reason why we are having this panel in general. One of the things that the Surgeon General said is that the inadequate access to resources is a major problem for teen mental health. And we're all, I think, collectively struggling with that. So we have questions coming in here saying, I'm told the wait list for the ADHD clinic is a year. Getting appointments is difficult, impossible. I have fill in the blank insurance, and my insurance will or won't cover the services I need. Wait list, wait list, wait list. How do we work to solve this problem?
We have a horrendous wait list in our clinic, and it pains me when we have families calling all the time, and we have had patients that have come to us, you know, an 8-year-old girl that had new onset tics. We saw her the first time when she was 10 and had had tics for 2 years with all of that, and it is horrendous. You know, we are working really hard to try to see as many people as we can, but the resources aren't there. And this is nationwide. So over the course of pandemic, estimates suggest that the rates of anxiety and depression more than doubled to, like, you know, some estimates of 40% of youth have anxiety or depression. That's, you know, how many tens or hundreds of millions of youth is that in this country? It is really difficult. The answers are better prevention. You know, we know the risk factors. We know what leads to depression. We know what leads to suicidality. We know what leads to substance abuse. It's pretty good. We got to get kids early. We got to keep kids healthier. We got to do more work to prevent the development by creating more of a healthy environment. That does nothing for you or any of you who have kids on the waiting list here. And I think there are different solutions. You know, there's a lot of tech-based solutions. Some are good, some aren't so good. But that's going to be important. But probably telehealth and more tech-based things are going to be a reasonably significant part of the solution. But right now, you know, with terms of our clinics, we're running at capacity. We're trying to hire people. You know, it's space, it's resources to hire people, and increasing the number of trainees. I mean, and it's very difficult. People in the community, the same thing. It's not just UCLA. I mean, everybody is full.
Yeah, I will make a plug for training more people in child psychiatry, and I think also engaging with other physicians, like providing education to pediatricians and PCPs, and empowering others to partner with us, because there is a lot that we can learn from, like global mental health as well, and bring those lessons over here and develop community partnerships.
There's a really exciting program at University of Oregon, the Ballmer Institute, and they have received, you know, Steve Ballmer owns the Clippers. They have been given an amazing amount of money to develop a training program for college students to train as mental health workers. And with the promise of, once they complete their undergraduate work, they are placed in schools to provide mental health care to kids in schools, in the environments in which these kids live and study. And I think that's going to be, you know, trying to bring more people into the mental health workforce. You know, we're kind of at the top of the food chain here, but, you know, we can do more in terms of training and supervising, and even supervising people who are supervising people. But these are not quick fixes.
I'll say a quick word on that. How many of you have never been to a mental health therapist? That's amazing. I mean, everyone has at some point. So oftentimes people are like, what happens, Dr. Fong, when you actually close the door, when you turn on the Zoom? What magic do you do? You know, and I think that's the key, is that there's nothing really magical that requires 40 years of training. It's I'm just being connected. I'm listening, I'm being empathetic, I'm making you laugh, I'm making you cry, you're making me laugh, you're making me cry, and we're connecting as real people. So oftentimes people say, I say, you know what, to empower yourself before you get into professional, you can do that self-care menu that we talk about. You don't need a professional to start making changes right away. But in our world, in the addiction world, we do have fortunate ability where we have a 12-step community that is available in real life as well as in on the Zoom that can get you adequately support. So that's a starting point. We also have that, of course, National Alliance for Mentally Ill for family members as a starting point, as resources. And in LA, we have lots of nonprofits that run events and things like that. I work at Betshuva, an amazing place that does addiction and mental health treatment, and they have community events, Shabbat services, and folks where you can talk to parents who've gone through treatment, you can talk to people in treatment. So if you're on a wait list, do not say, oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do for 2 years. There is absolutely other things you can do. You can learn, you can reach out to the community. And again, we live in a town that's got everything. We have revolving sushi 15 minutes from this building. You know that, John? Do you know that? Yeah. So we've got to be able to do this ourselves. So I want people to, again, go away with this optimistic view I have, is that we have incredible resources in this state. They're hard to find, but they're out there. And we have an incredible community that's out there. So do not rely on, I have to only be seen at UCLA, because there's lots of other supports and ideas and specialists out there, many who came here to support us tonight, other than our UCLA clinics. Jenna, what do you think about that?
I think that's really well said, and it would help me with my job in the ER. But we are here if all else fails.
All right, panelists, we're in the home stretch here, and a couple of last-minute questions. Some even flagged as burning questions. So we're going to take the first one. Many of today's questions come from the perspective of concerned, supportive parents. Not all adults are willing to engage youth around topics that they may call taboo, like mental health, like drugs, like sex. Any thoughts on what we can do to shift the broader public perspectives to destigmatize these topics?
Talk about them like we are talking about them today. I think that is a good start. And I think media is also playing a role, because they're also initiating conversations with regards to mental health. And also, like, one thing that I use in my clinic is allowing patients to bring media into my space and talk about, you know, the shows that they're watching or the music that they're listening, and how that also intersects with mental health. So I think just generating a lot of conversation around it to normalize these conversations.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say start at the home. Start at the home in your very homes.
I was at a meeting on campus last week focused on campus mental health and increasing mental health literacy, because so many people have no idea what mental health is versus mental illness. And one of the speakers gave a brilliant presentation, and what he said is, society has changed. We used to think of mental health disorders and know what they were. Now, it used to be, I'm sad. I'm sad because something bad happened. That doesn't mean you're depressed. It means sad. Sadness is a normal thing. Now I'm depressed. I'm nervous about going to this job interview. Everybody knew what that was. Now I'm terrified, I'm anxious, I'm OCD about going to this job interview. We have pathologized normal emotions to the point where everybody has a mental health condition, which means nobody has a mental health condition. We are not discriminating those that really do have problems and need problems from everybody else on TikTok and everywhere else that is making up, maybe they do, but making a living off of their mental health disorders, as some of these folks are. And I think it's a real problem, because that's where the stigma comes from, is we've lost compassion for the people that really need help because everybody is looking for help. And I think education is just absolutely critical, and it needs to start early. Geffen Academy, I don't know if you have kids at Geffen Academy, they have a mental health literacy course that is absolutely brilliant. And it reduces stigma, and it helps students make more knowledgeable understanding and decisions and choices about mental health. And I think that should be, hopefully will be in every school in the country with our help, with all of our help.
Well said. The antidote to stigma and shame is empathy, right? But how do you teach empathy as a skill? How do you learn empathy? How do you develop it? Eric and I play a lot of tennis. So if you think of empathy like a forehand, how do I get better at it? There are things I can do. There are things I can model. There's YouTube videos. But there's nothing like life experience and real connection. So last week I was doing a mental health summit like this for teenagers back in my hometown in Chicago, Illinois, in the suburbs. And many of the young people, which is always the best part, I asked them, well, what can be done? What do you think really needs to happen? And to a person, they all said something very simple. They said, we wish we just had more unstructured time. We wish we had more room to think and play and to screw up. I said, wow, I've never heard that. That's really, really good. And the last thing that the young woman said to me, she's like, and I wish that adults would recognize that we are young people with brains that work and not talk down to us and not talk at us, but talk with us. I could not say it any better than the way she said it. I said, that was really, really wonderful. And I think that's that message of empowerment. That's how you're raised. And I'll leave you with this thought. When I went in medical school, I went to Northwestern, pretty good school. And when I told a number of people I was going to go into addiction psychiatry, the year was 1997, they said, what a waste of your God-given talent to go into medicine. That shows you how far we've come in mental health. Where in the late 90s, when my mentors were saying, you could be so much of a better true doctor than a psychiatrist, to now in 2023, where the surge for psychiatry, the demand for psychiatry is at an all-time high. That's only 20 years. So imagine 25 years from now where we're going to be. And I'm really optimistic to see where we're going to be. So glass is half empty, as we say. Or is it half full? No, half full. Not half empty.
I dare say we're following the lead of some really important people. This panel began with the ideas of our board chairs over here to bring light to the teen mental health crisis, inspired by the Surgeon General of this country, who got way out in front to make this a public issue. So I think it goes right to that last question. We're all doing a part, everyone in this room can do the same, to speak openly about it, just the way the Surgeon General has, communicate about it, destigmatize it, educate each other about it, including difficult things like suicide, drugs, whatever it might be. And I really appreciate all of our panelists for fielding the questions. I appreciate the Resnick board and FOSI and Dr. Hansen for assembling this, and for all of you for showing up and bringing your really, I think, insightful questions to this. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hansen to close us out.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to this marvelous panel. My last act is to remind you that you got flyers with resources. So if there were some questions that you had that didn't get answered tonight, please don't hesitate to reach out, use the resources. And thanks again for making time on a weeknight to come and join us.
Thank you so much.